Why did the laughter stop the moment she stepped into the sand pit? 300 men had been loud only seconds earlier. Jokes, whistles, the sound of confidence bouncing off concrete and ego. Then she crossed the line, and something in the air shifted, not respect, not fear. Curiosity mixed with contempt, like watching an animal wander into traffic. She stood there without flinching. Green shorts, white tank top already damp from the fog, no rank on display, no name tape, nothing to protect her from the assumptions already forming in their minds. To them, she wasn't a soldier. She was a disruption, a statement, a mistake someone else had made and sent here for them to correct. The words came from the crowd before she could settle her footing. She's nothing but a hole to fill. Laughter followed, sharp, casual, practiced. She didn't look at them, didn't react. Her hands rested loose at her sides, fingers barely moving, like they were listening to something no one else could hear. Her breathing was slow, measured, the kind you learn only after panic stops being useful. She felt the scar on her forearm before she consciously reached for it, raised, pale, a reminder she touched without thinking, a habit born in places where hesitation meant death. Senior Chief Vance watched from above, arms crossed, jaw tight. To him, she wasn't a person. She was paperwork, a Pentagon directive wearing sneakers, a contamination of his program. He'd spent 22 years believing the world made sense if you enforced the right hierarchy. And she didn't fit. Captain Whitaker stood beside him, silent. He'd read her file 3 times, redactions stacked on redactions, years missing like someone had taken scissors to her life. He knew what that meant. You didn't erase history unless it scared someone. She felt the eyes on her now, 300 assessments being made in silence. And then a man stepped forward. Kyle Decca didn't ask permission. He never had. Big, confident, the kind of man whose strength had always been enough to silence consequences. He smiled as he moved, not because he was amused, but because he was certain. This would be quick. She watched him circle, watched the lazy stance, the arrogance. He didn't see her, not really. He saw an object in the wrong place. When he lunged, it wasn't training. His hands went straight for her throat. The sound that followed wasn't a scream. It was bone. What kind of woman steps into violence instead of away from it? She didn't retreat, didn't panic, didn't beg. She stepped forward. Her body moved before thought, years of repetition compressing into instinct, wrist intercepted, elbow trapped, hips rotated with precision that came from 1,000 invisible hours. The snap echoed like a gunshot. Then came his scream. Kyle Decca hit the sand, his arm wrong in a way the body does not forgive. White bone punched through skin. Red followed. The sound he made wasn't anger anymore. It was disbelief collapsing into pain. She stood over him, breath steady, eyes empty of triumph. 300 men froze. They'd seen violence, real violence, but this was different. This wasn't chaos. This was control, clean, final. No one moved. Medical rushed in seconds later, but the moment had already burned itself into memory. A woman half his size. No wasted motion. No apology. As they carried him away, promising vengeance through broken sobs, she didn't watch. She walked. Past the crowd, past the silence that had replaced laughter. No one stopped her. No one spoke. She became invisible again, but now it wasn't dismissal. It was uncertainty. Behind the equipment shed, she slid down against cold concrete. The fog was lifting. Her hands shook. Not from fear. From something older. She pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes, and the valley came back. Dust, blood, radio static screaming for time that wouldn't arrive. Daniel Brooks dying against her chest. She'd done everything right, every procedure, every call, held pressure until her arms burned, lied to him because hope was kinder than truth. He died anyway. Do not let them forget. She carried those words like a sentence. Her breathing slowed. Montana forest replaced Afghan dust. Her father's voice, low and steady. Control the breath. Control the moment. She stood. This wasn't over, not for her. Not for them. Why did the toughest training course on base suddenly feel like a test designed for one person alone? They called it an assessment. She recognized it for what it was. Punishment dressed as procedure. Midnight start, cold water, no ceremony. She swam until the ocean burned her lungs, marched until her hips felt like they were tearing loose, crawled through mud and wire that stripped skin without mercy. Her body screamed. She acknowledged it, filed it away. Pain was information, not a command. When they gave her 2 hours of sleep, she dreamed of hands closing around her throat and woke calm. Navigation came next. No GPS, no light, just terrain and memory. She found every checkpoint because land speaks if you know how to listen. At 300 they dragged her back into chaos. Casualty simulation. Blood, pressure, time compressing. She worked the problem, not fast, correct. The evaluators didn't praise. They never did. Silence was the closest thing to approval. When the ambush scenario flipped without warning, she adapted. New radios, new call signs, no excuses. She remembered Brooks coughing blood into the dirt and forced herself to breathe slower. By the time the shoot house came, she was hollowed out, 60 hours awake, 35 miles on her feet. She cleared every room. Sunrise found her standing. She didn't feel victorious. She felt quiet, as if something inside her had finally been acknowledged. What happens when the truth surfaces in a room built on denial? The briefing room was silent when her history was spoken aloud. Silver star, sealed citation, names no one else was allowed to say. She watched faces change as the story rearranged their assumptions, watched Senior Chief Vance unravel in real time. When he accused her, she spoke for the first time. Not loud. Clear. He put his hands on my throat. No embellishment, no anger, just fact. I've ended men who were better warriors than he'll ever be, she said, lifting her scarred arm. But I will not carry his hands on my neck, not for anyone. Silence answered her. Vance was relieved before the words finished echoing. No one applauded. This wasn't triumph, it was correction. Why does survival never feel like victory? 14 days later, her orders changed. Instructor, integration program, preparing women for the realities no one wanted to name. On her last morning at Coronado, she walked the beach alone. Cold sand, endless water. Whitaker joined her, spoke of courage, of sacrifice. She shook her head. It wasn't courage, she said, it was necessity. When he asked about Brooks' final words, she finally understood. He hadn't meant himself. He meant all of them. The forgotten, the unacknowledged, the silent dead. The sun rose, gold across the water. She touched the scar once more. Then she turned back toward the base. Toward what came next. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did she feel calmer facing 300 hostile men than she did standing alone with her own thoughts? The question surfaced as she walked away from the sand pit, boots sinking softly into damp ground, the noise behind her dissolving into a stunned hush. Violence had never unsettled her like silence did. Violence was honest. It announced itself. Silence waited. It let memory breathe. She didn't slow down, didn't look back. Every instinct told her to keep moving, to create distance before the world decided what to do with her. She passed rows of equipment cages, the metallic smell of oil and rust mixing with ocean air. The fog clung low, cold against her skin, beating on her arms like sweat that didn't belong to her. Only when she reached the shadow behind the maintenance shed did she stop. The concrete was cold when her back touched it. The chill traveled through her shirt, grounded her. She slid down until she was sitting, knees drawn slightly inward, elbows resting loosely on her thighs. Her hands trembled now. Small movements, almost invisible. Anyone watching might have missed it. She didn't. She had learned long ago to notice the smallest failures before they became catastrophic. She closed her eyes. The sound came first. Not screams, not gunfire, wind, moving through a valley that didn't officially exist, dust lifting in thin spirals, sunlight cutting through it at angles that made everything look unreal, like a memory already fading even as it formed. She was back there before she could stop it. Tangy Valley, March, thin air, thin margins. Daniel Brooks had been heavier than she expected when she dragged him. Not physically, she'd carried heavier loads. It was the weight of urgency that crushed her, the knowledge that time was already betraying them. She remembered the sound his breathing made. Wet, wrong, each inhale a fight, each exhale a surrender. She remembered the heat of his blood through her gloves as she pressed down, hard enough to hurt him if he'd lived long enough to feel it. She remembered lying to him. Not cruel lies, necessary ones. "Birds close," she'd said, over and over. "You're doing good, stay with me." He'd smiled once, just barely, like he knew. When his hand seized her forearm, she'd almost flinched. Not from pain, from desperation. His grip had been strong for a dying man, strong enough to leave a mark that never faded. Do not let them forget. At the time, she'd thought he meant his family, or the mission, or the failure. It had taken years to realize he meant something larger, something heavier. Her eyes opened. The fog had thinned. Light filtered through in pale sheets. Her breathing slowed as she counted it, just like her father had taught her in the woods behind their cabin when she was 8 years old and shaking from cold and fear. "In through the nose," he'd said, "out through the mouth, panic wastes oxygen." Her father had been a quiet man, not gentle, not cruel, precise. He believed the world did not care who you were, only whether you were prepared. He trained her not because he wanted a soldier, but because he understood what happened to women who couldn't defend themselves. She stood now, brushing sand from her shorts, composure locking back into place like armor. Whatever came next would not be faced from the ground. She didn't know yet that what came next was designed to break her. Why would they offer a second chance only after deciding you didn't deserve the first? 3 hours later, the summons came. No explanation, just orders. She walked into headquarters with the same controlled stillness she'd carried all morning. Senior Chief Vance stood outside the door, arms crossed, posture rigid. He didn't speak. His eyes followed her with something close to hatred, but beneath it something else flickered. Uncertainty. That unsettled him more than anger ever could. Inside, Captain Whitaker sat behind his desk, hands folded, expression unreadable. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper, normal things, almost obscene after the morning she'd lived. He spoke first. Clinical Decaz injury, surgery, career likely over. She absorbed it without reaction. Consequences were part of the job, always had been. Vance exploded next, words sharp, accusations spilling out like they'd been rehearsed, assault, disrespect, removal from the program. She remained silent, not out of fear, out of discipline. Speaking before being invited had never saved anyone. Whitaker raised a hand, just slightly, enough to stop the flood. One question, simple, devastating. Who initiated physical contact? Silence. The footage made it undeniable. Hands on her throat, aggression clear as daylight. Whitaker's voice didn't rise when he spoke again. It didn't need to. She would stay, but she would be assessed. The Combat Assessment Course. CA-70. Even the name carried weight. 2 days, minimal rest, designed not to test skill but resolve. No one completed it clean, that was the point. Midnight start. Vance smiled for the first time since the sand pit, not friendly, anticipatory. He built the course himself. He believed in it like doctrine. She met his eyes, no challenge, no defiance. Just acknowledgement. She'd seen worse. Why does the body beg you to quit long before the mind gives permission? The ocean didn't care that it was night. 57 degrees, black water, waves slapping against her face with indifference. She swam until her shoulders burned and her breath turned shallow. She found rhythm, counted strokes, focused on the next buoy, then the next. When her muscles screamed, she let them. Pain was temporary, failure wasn't. The ruck march followed, 70 pounds digging into her hips, each step a negotiation between momentum and collapse. She thought of Montana winters, of tracking deer through snow until her toes went numb, of her father's voice telling her that stopping was a choice. Obstacle course, mud, wire, rope tearing skin from palms already raw. She didn't rush. Rushing led to mistakes. Mistakes led to injuries that ended careers quietly. By dawn, she was exhausted. By noon, she was hollow. Navigation stripped away the last illusion of comfort. No light, no electronics, just land and memory. She moved through it like she belonged there because she did. Terrain had never lied to her. When they gave her 2 hours of sleep, she didn't dream. Her mind was too tired to betray her. They woke her violently. Casualty scenario, blood simulant everywhere, timers counting down like a heartbeat. She worked the problem with hands that moved on their own. Tourniquet, seal, needle, airway, words spoken clearly into a radio she barely recognized. She finished early. No praise. Only another clipboard mark. The ambush scenario was meant to crush her. New systems, new rules, isolation. She adapted because adaptation was survival. She organized chaos because chaos didn't scare her anymore. She remembered Brooks dying while she waited for help that came too late, and refused to wait now. By the time she entered the shoot house, she was running on something deeper than adrenaline, purpose, habit, muscle memory earned the hard way. 4 rooms, 7 targets, 14 rounds. 0 mistakes. When she stepped back into daylight, the sun was rising. She hadn't slept in 60 hours. Her legs shook when she stopped moving. But she was still standing. Why does endurance feel lonelier than defeat? She stood at the edge of the course as instructors whispered behind clipboards. No smiles, no congratulations, just numbers and notes and quiet recalculations. Vance watched her from a distance. The certainty he'd carried like a weapon was gone now, replaced by something that unsettled him deeply. She didn't look at him. She looked inward. At the place that still hurt, at the weight she carried for men who would never be named, for missions that never happened on paper, for scars no one was allowed to ask about. She didn't want revenge. She wanted acknowledgement. Not applause, not admiration. Just the truth spoken plainly. As she was finally dismissed, exhaustion crashed into her like surf. Her pride didn't swell. Her anger didn't rise. Only a quiet determination settled deeper. She had survived again. And survival, she knew, was never the end of the story. It was only the proof that you could carry what came next. Why did the room feel smaller once everyone realized who she really was? It happened slowly, not all at once, like a pressure change you don't notice until your ears start ringing. She felt it as soon as she stepped into the briefing room after the assessment. The air was different, not hostile, not welcoming either, watchful. Conversations cut off when she passed. Eyes followed her longer than before, not with laughter now, with calculation. She took a seat near the back, spine straight, hands resting on her thighs. Her body ached in places she didn't bother numbing. 61 hours awake had stripped everything down to essentials. Hunger, fatigue, awareness. Emotion lived somewhere deeper, waiting its turn. Senior Chief Vance entered last. He didn't look at her. That alone told her something had changed. Captain Whitaker stood at the front, posture formal, voice even as he began reading results. Numbers, timings, evaluations. Words like exceptional and exceeded standards floated through the room, detached from her as if they belonged to someone else. She didn't react. Praise had never made her safer. Then Whitaker paused. The silence stretched just long enough to draw breath into it. "I received communication this morning," he said, "from the Office of the Under-Secretary of Defense for Intelligence." She felt it then, not fear, recognition. This was the moment the past stopped staying buried. He continued carefully, like someone handling live ordnance. Her service history, her real one. Task Force Obsidian. The name landed heavy. Even the operators who pretended not to know it stiffened. You didn't speak about units like that. You pretended they were rumors, ghosts. Whitaker didn't pretend. He spoke of deployments that didn't exist, of actions that never happened, of citations sealed so tightly they might as well have been lies. Silver Star. Her jaw tightened, just slightly. She hadn't thought about the medal in years. It lived in a box she never opened, because opening it meant remembering faces she'd spent years trying not to see when she slept. When he mentioned the Tangi Valley, her fingers curled once against her leg. Daniel Brooks' name remained unspoken. That was mercy. Then Whitaker addressed the tattoo. She felt eyes burn into her forearm, some recognition, some disbelief, some fear. The symbol wasn't flashy, small, black, meaningless to anyone who didn't already know. Only a handful did. She'd never intended for it to be seen, but intention rarely survived reality. Senior Chief Vance stood abruptly. "This is garbage," he snapped. "Some Pentagon narrative to justify." "Sit down," Whitaker said. "Not loud. Absolute." Vance didn't sit immediately. His eyes locked on her, searching for something, weakness, triumph, apology. He found none of it. "She's nobody," he insisted, voice cracking now. "You're telling me this woman." "She is a decorated combat veteran," Whitaker said evenly, "and you permitted an assault against her." The word hung there. Assault. It stripped away euphemism, training accident, misjudgment, aggression. Assault. Vance opened his mouth again, but she spoke first. Her voice surprised even her, not because it shook, because it didn't. "He put his hands on my throat." Every word landed clean. No anger, no embellishment, just fact. The room held its breath. "You watched," she continued quietly, "and you smiled." She stood then, slowly, letting the movement register, letting them see her not as an idea, not as a disruption, but as a woman who had survived things they would never be briefed on. "I've ended men who were better warriors than Kyle Decca will ever be," she said. "I carry their faces with me every night." She lifted her scarred forearm. "But I will not carry his hands on my neck, not for you, not for anyone." Silence followed, deep, final. She didn't feel victorious, only tired. Vance's authority collapsed in that quiet. You could see it happen. Years of certainty dissolving as the room recalibrated around a truth he couldn't dominate. Whitaker finished it. Relief of duty, investigation, immediate removal. Two masters-at-arms appeared at the door. Vance walked out without another word. No one clapped. No one spoke. She sat back down. Why does justice feel so empty when it arrives too late? The room emptied slowly after that. Operators filed out with expressions she'd learned to read long ago. Some were ashamed. Some were thoughtful. A few were angry in ways that had nothing to do with her. None approached her. That was fine. She wasn't there to be understood. She remained seated until the last chair scraped against the floor and the door clicked shut. Only then did she exhale fully, shoulders dropping a fraction. Whitaker lingered. "You okay?" he asked. She considered the question. Physically, barely. Emotionally, complicated. "I will be," she said. He nodded, didn't press. He had learned, she realized, the same lesson she had years ago, that some questions were not owed answers. She left the building alone. Outside, the afternoon sun felt too bright. The base hummed with routine, trucks moving, commands shouted, life continuing as if nothing fundamental had shifted. But something had. Not the institution. Institutions changed slowly, if at all. But perception. She was no longer invisible. That unsettled her more than hostility ever had. Why did the weight she carried feel heavier after being acknowledged? That night sleep finally came. Not gently. She dreamed of hands again, but not on her throat this time, on her forearm. Daniel Brooks' grip, his breath shallow, his eyes focused on her like she was the last solid thing in a dissolving world. Do not let them forget. She woke before dawn, heart steady, eyes dry. She had learned how to live with ghosts. The trick wasn't banishing them. It was giving them somewhere to stand so they didn't follow you everywhere. 2 weeks passed. Paperwork moved faster than expected. Careers unraveled quietly. Whispers followed her through corridors she rarely walked now. Some men avoided her. Others watched from a distance, reassessing old beliefs they hadn't realized were fragile. Then the orders came. New assignment. Instructor. Integration program. Her first reaction wasn't pride. It was resistance. She hadn't asked to be a symbol. She didn't want to be an example. She wanted to do her job quietly, effectively, without becoming a lesson someone else twisted for their own comfort. But she read the orders again. Prepare female operators for advanced combat training. Ensure integration without compromise. Prevent recurrence of incident. She understood then. This wasn't about her. This was about the next woman standing alone in a sand pit, surrounded by laughter that turned sharp. She accepted. Why does responsibility arrive disguised as redemption? On her final morning at Coronado, she walked the beach before sunrise. Bare feet, cold sand. The Pacific stretched endless and gray, breathing in slow, patient waves. She liked water for that reason. It never hurried, never explained itself. Footsteps approached behind her. Whitaker stopped beside her, hands in his pockets, gaze on the horizon. "I read the full citation," he said after a while. She nodded, eyes still forward. "What you did in the valley," he continued, "was the bravest thing I've encountered in 23 years. She shook her head slightly. "It wasn't bravery," she said. "It was the moment." He considered that. Then he asked about Brooks, about the words. She watched the line where sky met water, thinking of mountains instead, of forests, of a man teaching his daughter to breathe through fear. "He wasn't talking about himself," she said finally. "He meant all of them." Whitaker stayed silent. "Everyone who serves in shadow," she went on. "Everyone who doesn't get remembered because remembering them would be inconvenient." She turned toward the base, where the day was beginning. "As a trainer," she said, "I can make sure they don't forget." The sun crested the horizon, turning gray into gold. She touched the scar on her forearm once more. Not in mourning. In acknowledgement. Then she walked back toward what came next, knowing the hardest part wasn't surviving violence. It was choosing what to do with the truth after you did. Why did standing in front of them feel harder than standing alone in the sand pit ever had? The classroom smelled like fresh paint and old anxiety. 22 women sat in rigid rows, backs straight, eyes forward, uniforms still crisp in a way that wouldn't last long. Some looked confident. Some looked guarded. A few carried the quiet tension of people who had already learned what it meant to be underestimated. Renat stood at the front of the room, hands resting lightly on the edge of the podium. No slides, no dramatic introduction, just her presence. She felt every scar ache at once, not physically but memory deep. This was different from combat. In combat, failure was loud, immediate. Here, failure would be subtle. It would echo forward into lives she would never fully see. She took a breath. "You weren't selected because someone wanted to prove a point," she began. Her voice was calm, even. The room leaned in without realizing it. "You're here because you met the standard. Everything else you'll hear about why you're in this room is noise." A few shoulders loosened, others stiffened, unsure whether to believe her. She understood that hesitation intimately. "When people doubt you," she continued, "they'll disguise it as concern, or humor, or tradition. They'll tell you they're protecting the program. What they're really protecting is comfort." She paused, let the silence work. "I can't change that for you," she said. "What I can do is prepare you for it." No promises, no speeches about empowerment, just truth. She dismissed them 10 minutes early. Not as a kindness, as a test. Those who lingered afterward were the ones she watched closest. Why do the smallest acts of resistance leave the deepest marks? The program didn't start with weapons. It started with discomfort. Long days, little explanation, tasks that felt pointless until they weren't. Renat stripped away expectation the same way her father had stripped away fear, by replacing it with repetition. She watched how they reacted when corrected publicly, when ignored, when praised and then tested harder than their peers. One candidate, Morales, clenched her jaw every time someone interrupted her. Another, Chen, shrank when challenged, then overperformed in isolation. Patel hid exhaustion behind humor until her knees buckled on a ruck march and she refused assistance. Renat saw herself in all of them. She never raised her voice, never humiliated, never rescued. She corrected, she waited, she observed. At night, alone in her quarters, the weight crept back in. The quiet allowed memories through cracks she couldn't fully seal. Brooks the valley, the sound of his breathing stopping. She didn't drink, didn't numb herself. She sat with it, let it hurt. Because numbness was the real enemy. Why does authority fear what it can't control? Not everyone welcomed the program. Emails arrived thinly veiled as questions, scheduling conflicts, resource limitations, comments about readiness and cohesion, words chosen carefully to avoid saying what they meant. Renat answered each one clinically. Facts, performance data, documentation. She didn't argue. She let results do the talking. When one visiting instructor dismissed her corrections during a joint exercise, she waited until after the evolution ended. Then she asked him to walk her through his decisions. Calm, curious. By the third question, he realized he couldn't. He avoided her after that. That was fine. Control, she'd learned, didn't come from dominance. It came from competence that couldn't be ignored. Why does progress always feel like provocation? The first real incident happened during week 6. Joint combatives training, mixed groups, observers everywhere. One male operator refused to pair with Morales, said it distracted him, said it wasn't personal. Renat watched Morales' expression shift, not angry, not surprised, resigned. Something inside Renat tightened. She stepped in. "You'll pair with her," she said evenly. He scoffed, rolled his shoulders. "With respect, Sergeant, this isn't." "This isn't a debate," she replied. "This is training." He looked at her like Decal once had, not the same man, same assumption. The sparring was clean, controlled. Morales didn't dominate. She endured. She adapted. She finished. When the whistle blew, she stood breathing hard, eyes steady. The operator wouldn't meet her gaze. Later, Morales approached Renee, voice low. "Thank you." Renee shook her head. "You didn't need me," she said. "You needed the opportunity." That night, Renee couldn't sleep. The image of Decaz's hands flashed uninvited. The sound of bone breaking echoed behind her eyes. She sat up, pressed her feet into the floor, and breathed until the present returned. Trauma didn't announce itself. It waited. Why do old wounds reopen when you finally feel safe? The call came just before dawn. Unknown number, encrypted line. She answered without speaking. "Caldwell," a voice said, familiar, tired. Her spine straightened. "Ma'am," she replied. Task Force Obsidian didn't exist. But its survivors did. They spoke briefly, carefully, nothing operational, just confirmation. A memorial service was being planned, quiet, off-record, for Brooks. Time had passed. Clearances had shifted. Enough space had opened for acknowledgement, if not officially, then honestly. After the call ended, Renee sat motionless. She'd imagined this moment for years, thought it would bring relief. It didn't. It brought grief back sharp enough to cut. She attended the service alone, no uniform, no insignia. Just names read softly, candles flickering, faces etched with recognition and restraint. When Brooks' name was spoken, her throat closed. She didn't cry. She stood. Sometimes honoring the dead meant staying upright. Why does healing feel like betrayal? The next morning, training resumed. No allowances, no softness. Some of the candidates noticed something different in her, not weakness, weight. She pushed them harder that day, not out of anger but urgency. The world wouldn't wait for them to be ready. She watched Morales lead a team through a navigation problem with quiet authority. Watched Chen challenge an instructor respectfully and hold her ground. Watched Patel ask for help and keep moving. Something loosened in Renee's chest. This was why she was here. Not to prove anything. To prepare. Why does leadership mean carrying what no one else sees? By the end of the cycle, injuries were minimal. Performance was high. Attrition lower than predicted. The data spoke clearly. So did the silence that followed it. Resistance didn't vanish. It recalibrated. Renee knew better than to mistake acceptance for victory. On the final day, she stood before the candidates again. "You'll leave here with skills," she said, "but skills aren't what will save you when things turn personal." She met their eyes one by one. Boundaries will. No applause. Just understanding. As the room emptied, she remained behind. She touched the scar on her forearm, not in pain, not in remembrance, but in grounding. Brooks' words had shaped her life. But these women would shape what came next. And for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something she had to survive. It felt like something she could build. Why did the silence after success feel heavier than the struggle that came before it? The training cycle ended without ceremony. No speeches, no banners, just paperwork, evaluations, and the quiet shuffling of people moving on to whatever came next. The candidates dispersed in small groups, some laughing too loudly, others already retreating inward, preparing for the environments that would test them far beyond controlled scenarios. Renee watched them go from a distance. She felt proud, carefully, cautiously. Pride had sharp edges if you held it wrong. She had learned that the hard way. Still, it was there. A low, steady warmth beneath the familiar weight she carried. That night, alone in her quarters, the quiet returned. No radios, no boots outside the door, no reason to stay alert. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her hands. They looked older than she felt, strong, scarred, capable, hands that had ended lives, hands that had tried and failed to save one. Sleep came slowly. When it did, it brought the past with it. Why does the mind return to moments you would trade everything to forget? She was back in the valley again. But this time it was wrong. Too quiet. No gunfire. No radio chatter. Just wind moving through dry grass. Brooks stood a few feet away, whole, uninjured, watching her with that same calm expression he'd worn even as he was dying. "You did what you could," he said. She tried to speak, but no sound came. "You're still trying," he continued. "That's why it hurts." She woke with tears already cooling on her face. She didn't wipe them away. She let them exist. Healing, she was learning, wasn't about erasing pain. It was about allowing it space without letting it consume you. Why does the world test you again the moment you start to breathe? The incident report crossed her desk 3 weeks later. Another base, another training environment, another woman. Different details, same pattern. Dismissive comments, escalation masked as joking. A hand on an arm held a second too long, authority looking the other way because addressing it would be inconvenient. No broken bones this time. But the trajectory was familiar. Renee read the report twice, then a third time. She felt the old anger stir, not explosive, not blinding, focused. She requested permission to observe the unit under the guise of a training audit. Approval came faster than she expected. That worried her. Why do people mistake composure for compliance? The base was smaller, less scrutiny, the kind of place where culture calcified quickly because no one challenged it. She arrived unannounced. Introductions were polite, guarded. She recognized the looks immediately: assessment, categorization, dismissal waiting its turn. She didn't confront anyone on day one. She observed. She watched how the female operator, Lieutenant Harris, was spoken over in briefings, how her suggestions were rephrased by others and then praised, how she laughed at comments that weren't funny because correcting them would mark her as difficult. Renee saw the toll it took, the tension in Harris' shoulders, the way her voice tightened when she spoke, like she was bracing for impact. On the third day, Renee intervened. Not dramatically. During a planning session, she asked Harris to walk the room through her proposal. She didn't interrupt, didn't allow interruptions. When the plan proved solid, as Renee already knew it would, she said nothing else. The silence did the work. Later, Harris found her outside the building, eyes sharp with unshed emotion. "Why?" she asked. "Why help me?" Renee answered honestly. "Because someone should have helped me sooner." Why does standing up feel riskier than staying silent? The backlash was subtle. A meeting rescheduled without her. Emails left unanswered. A senior officer questioning her approach in language that sounded supportive but wasn't. She documented everything. Facts were harder to argue with than feelings. Still, the tension built. It culminated during a live fire exercise. A safety call was ignored. Harris spoke up. She was overruled. Renee stepped in. Training halted. Every eye turned toward her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't explain herself. She cited protocol, quoted regulation, calm, precise. The exercise resumed only after corrections were made. That night, a formal complaint was filed against her. Not from Harris. From someone who felt exposed. Why does accountability feel like an attack to those who have never faced it? The investigation was swift. Interviews, statements, footage reviewed. Renee sat alone in a small room, answering questions she'd answered before in different contexts. Not defensive, not emotional. Just accurate. She thought of Brooks again, of how he'd trusted her with his last moments, of how trust was something you honored, not demanded. The findings came back clear. No wrongdoing. But the message underneath was unmistakable. She was becoming inconvenient. Why does change require someone willing to absorb the impact. Her orders shifted again. Expanded authority, broader scope. Official language framed it as recognition. Unofficially, it was containment. She accepted without comment. If being placed in the margins allowed her to protect more people, she would live in the margins. She traveled constantly now, different bases, different faces, same patterns repeating in new configurations. Each time she adjusted. She mentored quietly, corrected firmly, supported without spectacle. She watched confidence grow where fear had lived, watched women speak up sooner, stand straighter, breathe easier. It wasn't perfect, but it was movement. Why does purpose feel heavier than survival? One evening, alone in an unfamiliar barracks room, she received a message. From Morales. Short, simple. Past selection, thank you. Renas stared at the screen longer than necessary. Then another message arrived. From Harris. Got command of the next exercise, didn't back down. More followed over time, not praise, updates. Proof. She sat back against the wall and closed her eyes. For the first time in years, the weight she carried shifted. It didn't disappear, but it redistributed. She wasn't carrying it alone anymore. Why does redemption come quietly, without applause? Months later, she returned to Coronado briefly. Different atmosphere, not transformed, just altered. A few nods of recognition, some respect, some lingering discomfort. She didn't linger. On the beach at dusk, she stood watching the waves roll in, endless and indifferent. She thought of her father, of Brooks, of every woman who had stood where she stood now and wondered if enduring was the same as living. She touched the scar on her forearm. I didn't forget, she said softly to no one. The wind carried the words away. That was enough. Because sometimes redemption doesn't look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like persistence. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay. Why did the future feel quieter than the past, even after everything she had survived? The morning she finally stopped running came without announcement. No orders, no alarms, no urgent message pulling her somewhere else. Just light slipping through the window of her quarters, pale and steady, touching the edges of a life that no longer revolved around immediate threat. Renas sat on the edge of the bed longer than necessary, feet on the floor, hands resting on her knees. For years, stillness had meant danger. Stillness meant time to remember, time to feel. Now it felt earned. She dressed slowly, not in uniform, civilian clothes, simple, unmarked. She barely recognized herself without rank, without purpose stitched into fabric, and yet this version of her felt no weaker. If anything, she felt more real. Outside, the base was waking up, engines turning over, doors slamming, voices calling out times and tasks. The machine continued, indifferent to individual stories. It always had. She walked toward the perimeter road, the one that curved past the training grounds and down toward the water. The Pacific was calm that morning, stretched out like a held breath. She stopped near the fence line and rested her forearms against the cool metal. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about what she needed to fix. She was thinking about what she had already done. Why do we measure our lives by the moments we didn't break? Faces came to her uninvited. Morales standing taller than she ever had before. Harris speaking with certainty instead of caution. Chen, Patel, and others whose names would never be known beyond small circles, but whose confidence now occupied space that once belonged to doubt. She hadn't saved them. She'd simply refused to let the world crush them quietly. And somehow, that felt heavier than any mission she'd ever carried. Her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. She already knew who it was. The Obsidian network was thin now, Fewer voices, fewer names. Time had taken its share. Bureaucracy had taken the rest. Memorial finalized, the message read, "Private next month." She closed her eyes. Daniel Brooks. She pictured him not as he died, but as he'd been before the valley, focused, calm, certain in a way that made others steadier just by proximity. She typed a single word in reply. "I'll be there." Why does closure feel more like acceptance than relief? The memorial took place far from any base. No flags, no formal honor guard, just a quiet clearing bordered by trees, chosen deliberately because it didn't belong to anyone who needed permission. A handful of people stood together, men and women who carried themselves with the subtle posture of those who had learned how to disappear. No insignia, no introductions. They didn't need them. When Brooks' name was spoken, it didn't echo, it settled. Renee felt the familiar tightening in her chest, but it didn't crush her this time. It simply reminded her that love and loss often lived in the same place. When it was over, no one lingered long. Goodbyes were brief. Eye contact held just a second longer than normal. She stayed behind. The clearing grew quiet again. Wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and earth. She knelt and pressed her palm flat against the ground. "Do not let them forget," she whispered. Not as a promise, as a statement of fact. Why does peace arrive only after you stop demanding it? Life after Obsidian didn't announce itself as a new chapter. It unfolded slowly. Assignments became shorter, consultations instead of commands, training frameworks instead of direct oversight. Her name carried weight now, not publicly, but in the rooms where decisions were quietly shaped. She turned down promotions that would have pulled her into administrative silence, accepted roles that kept her close to people, close to friction. She had learned that influence worked best from proximity. Some nights the memories still came. Hands, blood, the sound of breathing stopping. But they no longer owned her. She let them pass through, acknowledged, unresisted. That was the difference. Why do we mistake loud victories for meaningful ones? Years later, no one would remember the exact day Kyle Decca's career ended. His name would fade into footnotes, into cautionary anecdotes told by people who never quite understood the full story. Renee didn't care. What mattered were the small changes that didn't make headlines. A policy rewritten in neutral language that closed loopholes. An instructor removed quietly before damage could be done. A young woman standing her ground sooner because she had seen it modeled. Change didn't arrive as a revolution. It arrived as repetition. And Renee understood repetition better than most. Why does strength look different once you stop proving it? On her final official day of service, there was no ceremony. She declined it. She turned in her credentials, signed the forms, walked out of the building without looking back. At the edge of the base, she paused. The fence, the road, the water beyond. She thought of her father, long gone now, of the mornings in the Montana woods, of learning to move quietly, to breathe, to survive. She thought of Brooks, whose final words had shaped everything that followed. She realized then that she had fulfilled them, not by force, not by violence, but by presence. By refusing to disappear. Why does dignity never need permission? She drove until the base was out of sight. The road opened ahead of her, empty and unremarkable, the kind of road most people wouldn't remember. She liked that. Somewhere behind her, training continued. New candidates arrived. New stories began. She wasn't needed there anymore. And for the first time, that didn't feel like loss. It felt like success. Why does the quiet matter more than the applause ever could? That night in a small rented cabin far from everything, Renee sat on the porch and watched the sun dip below the tree line. No uniform, no radio, no one watching. She traced the scar on her forearm gently. It no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like a record. She had been tested, dismissed, broken, rebuilt. She had stood when others expected her to fall. She had acted when silence would have been easier. And she had carried the weight without demanding recognition. The world would move on. It always did. But somewhere, someone would stand a little straighter because she had once stood her ground. And that was enough. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't argue. It doesn't ask to be seen. Sometimes, it simply acts.